Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. And my red light isn't on. Do I need, it's working? Okay. Pleased to be here. It's a very enjoyable spot to be, and I've enjoyed moving around a little bit in the area. And so tonight we want to talk about financial literacy and its role in retirement planning. And the way I'm going to approach this is to talk in some general terms, but then also to talk about some specific research that I've done over the last 5 or 6 years. So hopefully that will be of your interest. And if you have questions along the way, just raise a hand and we'll take them. So what do we know about financial literacy in the United States? First, a lot of studies have been trying to measure financial literacy for some time, and it's often very surprising to see how low financial literacy is. The way people have done this is to ask particular survey questions about inflation, compounding, and things like that you would think would be relatively easy for them to handle, and in fact, they're not. This is consistent across lots of studies. It's consistent across studies in other countries, and so financial literacy could be a problem for American workers and other workers to think about how they're going to make their retirement decisions. One of the things that I've been looking at is, can workers learn or improve their level of financial literacy? And if so, where would they do that? How would they do that? What kinds of programs would best fit that? One way that, one of the lack of knowledge areas that they have is about company benefits. And if you think about making retirement decisions, a lot of retirement decisions are based on what is the company offering us and how do we make decisions that maximize the value that we get from our company employee benefits. Which leads me to the last issue, is that the work site turns out to be an excellent place to have financial literacy. And so that's where I focused some of my research recently. And I've been one of the few people that actually gone into the work sites and talked to companies and workers and tried to measure the impact of the programs that they're having. So we have some budding economists here that hope to have research jobs in the future. And so they've all had their economics courses, and they've all done their life cycle models, right? Everybody's done a life cycle model over here? Oh, where individuals look over their lifetime, plan for the future, even as they're making decisions today. And there's some standard life cycle models that if you put them in, people have maximized those for years. They've done a lot of work on that. But what are people assuming when they do that in their research papers? They're basically assuming that people know something. They're making decisions based on their knowledge. And of course, if their knowledge is wrong, they may well be making suboptimal decisions. And so that's what we want to talk a bit about tonight. So what we see in the United States, and really a lot of places around the world, is some changes in the types of pensions that employers are providing. And one thing that's happening is the movement away from the traditional defined benefit plans toward defined contribution plans. Most of the work that people have done on defined contribution plans has been on the 401k plans. Everybody, I assume, knows what a 401k plan is. It's what lots of companies offer these days. And in general, it's the only plan they've offered. So they've moved away from offering a defined benefit plan, closing those down, moving toward the defined contribution plans. Those 401k plans, we'll talk some more about them later. 403b plans are a comparable sort of plan that actually started even before 401k plans, but they're limited mainly to the higher, not higher education, but the educational sectors and some hospitals and a few other things that could offer a 403b. So what do you have here? Do you have a 403b? 401k. Okay. So 401k plans now can only be offered by private sector employers. Only started by those. If you had one way in the past and you're a public sector employee, you can keep them. 403b plans are only in education or a few other things. And 457 plans, again, are similar plans, but only for public sector employers. So the key to these plans is workers, individual workers, have to make decisions about how much to contribute, how to invest their money, and how to withdraw that money. And of course, if you were faced with those decisions, as many of you will be, the question is, what do you know and how can you make those decisions in a way that is in your best interest? And if you don't understand compounding, if you don't understand inflation, if you don't understand risk, it's hard to make those good choices. So when we look across the country and we look at these 401k plans or other types of plans, it's really hard to figure out why people don't contribute to them. Because most of these plans have an employer match. And in many plans, the employer match is 100%. So the first day you put $1,000 in, the company puts $1,000 in, and you've made 100% on your money. Now, there's the risk of going ahead and investing that money in the future, but most of these plans also have relatively safe investments that you could put your money in as well. In addition to the employer match, there are substantial tax advantages in these plans, whether you're choosing a Roth type plan or a standard IRA. I would say that all the research in this area basically has been on 401k plans. Recently, I've started doing some work on 403b plans, looking at school teachers in North Carolina. And the same sort of issues come up. And in fact, it may be even more complex there. In the public sector, it's still most common for the worker to be covered by a defined benefit plan and have an option of contributing to a defined contribution plan. In the private sector, it's increasingly just the 401k plan. Although big companies, unionized companies, still often have a defined benefit plan and a 401k plan, but even there it's eroding. So we see some advantages. We wonder, well, why didn't everybody want 100% on their money? Why not? Yeah. We'll put you on the road here in a minute. Let you talk to people about that. And even those that contribute often don't take full advantage of the match. So you would think, I've talked to a lot of employers, and employers say, well, sometimes we use this sort of as a check of intelligence, right? If you don't put your money in your 401k plan and we're matching it 100%, you're not the type of worker that we want. But still we find. Okay, so why are participation rates so low? Well, there are some reasons why you might not want to contribute, even with this advantage. And so some of us might have student loans. Some of us might have credit card debts where the interest rates on those are pretty high and you can build up. And so maybe you ought to pay down those debts first. So that's a choice that people would have to make. And then, of course, it could be inertia. Who knows about inertia? We haven't finished that dissertation yet, and boy, it's hard, and I'll finish it someday, but you need to keep at it. Certainly, a lack of knowledge is a big issue as well. If the failure to present is based on a lack of knowledge, or you forgot about it, or it's inertia, maybe an employer nudge would help. And I'm going to talk a little bit about nudges today as well. So if you're thinking about when people make decisions or teachable moments, the question is, when do they occur, how often do they occur, and are those good times for making actions on your savings? And so I'm highlighting two specific time periods because these are two areas where I've done some research, both for people newly hired and people nearing retirement. And the question is, can you alter people's behavior by providing information? Can they learn? And if they learn, do they change their expectations for retirement age or planning or contributing to these plans? So a quick review, we're going to talk first about some new hires, second, older workers approaching retirement, and then what do I think are some punchlines that hopefully you'll want to take away with you. So the research project that I did on newly hired workers was funded by the Social Security Administration, and what I did there was I formed a partnership with 6 large national employers and asked them to give me data on their new hires from 2008 to 2010, and let's see what they did with their retirement savings plans, and then let's see how that changes with maybe alterations in the 401k plan and or any nudges that might happen. So we ended up with about 10,000 newly hired workers had all the usual stuff. These are administrative records that we're getting. So we're not, in this case, we're not talking to workers. We're going to the employer, telling them, here's a study that we think might help you. When, since I'm giving away free research, companies sort of like that sometimes, I'm saying if you provide me with the data, I'll provide you with a report that could help you with your HR department. So interestingly enough, during this time period, 2 employers had adopted automatic enrollment. We're going to talk about what that is. All but one of the employers had an employer match, and then some of them also offered a defined benefit plan. So these are big companies, many still having a defined benefit plan. They're paying pretty good wages, but they have low wage workers as well. So let's go back for a minute and talk about what automatic enrollment is. Who knows? Question, quick. Yes?
When someone gets put into the 401k plan, once they come in the door, whether or not they decide they want it or not?
Yeah, so this is the case. The usual case that has been, ever since 401k plans have been around, is that you're hired, you're told what your wage is, you're told that there is a 401k plan, and you have to make the decision to sign up for it. And then you have to make a decision, how much are you going to set aside and where your money is going to go. Automatic enrollment, you're hired, you're put in the plan. If you're put in the plan, the company has to specify some defaults. And one default is, of course, how much they're going to take out of your paycheck. And a second default is, where's that money going to go? Because if you don't tell them, they don't know, so they have to have a default. And so there's a lot of complexities here, and we're going to look at some of those issues. Now, we're all economists. We all think rationally, right? So you would think this wouldn't matter, right? Because the only difference in those 2 plans is that in the first case, what we might call opt-in, that you have to make a decision to opt in. All you have to do is go to the HR office, maybe even on your own computer, punch one button, and you're signed up. The automatic enrollment puts you in, but if you want out, punch one button and you're done. So this shouldn't matter, right? We'll see. So here's a case of one of the companies we looked at over their new hires of these years, and of course, you could guess where they introduced automatic enrollment, 2008, and so in this case, you see about a 30 percentage point difference between the proportion of people participating in the plan based on this one policy change. Shouldn't matter? It definitely does. And lots of studies have looked at this, and they all find somewhere in this neighborhood that if you have an opt-in plan, maybe 65 to 75% of the people participate. If you have an automatic enrollment plan, you get 95%. Now, part of this is for new hires, and one of the dynamics of workers is that sometimes you're hired, and then after a year or so, you enter into these plans. So the ultimate difference may not be as big as the initial difference, but still, that's huge. Roughly a 30 percentage point increase. Now, one of the problems is that you have to specify a default. And the default, one of the first key default is how much are you going to take out of the person's paycheck? And the company has to decide. And so the company says 3%. Well, one of the things that could happen in that world is that people that ultimately make the decision on their own might have contributed more. But if you automatically enroll them at 3%, that same old inertia can play that they stay at 3%. They don't increase it over time, and that's where they initially start out. And so these data are reflecting that the 2 years before, these are people that were contributing, and then over there you've got people that are contributing. So we're, in a sense, leaving out some of the zeros here if you weren't in it all. But it does show that the average participation rate of some people could actually go down with automatic enrollment. And so you want to be careful about how you pick that number. And for those of you that are policy wonks, you might want to think that why didn't this happen earlier? Why didn't we have automatic enrollment sooner? There's a lot of issues about garnishing of wages that people worried about, companies were worried about. They were taking this money out, and what if they lost money before the employees signed off on it? So Congress passed some laws that sort of gave some safe harbors with these kinds of plans. And this is just showing the pre-automatic enrollment bunching 0%, 3%, and then 6%, and 6% was the maximum match. So you see, even those people contributing, most of them weren't at the match, maximum match. You change this to the automatic enrollment, and the automatic enrollment was, guess what, 3%. And so you have this huge bunching there, and actually fewer people out on this far end. So again, you see a little bit of people choosing to contribute, to stay at the match and not contributing more than the match. So I don't know if any of you have ever worked in companies or not, but you know that when you're first hired, you have this orientation and people talk about all the benefits that you're going to get. There's a lot of information floating around, and you're nudging people in a particular direction. You're trying to encourage them to sign up for this program because you think it's good for them, it's good for the company, but not everybody does. And we know that automatic enrollment increases that. And just if you look at by characteristics, you see different characteristics of people, excuse me, are less or more likely to contribute to the plans. These are sort of standard information that you would find in lots of studies. Lower income people tend to contribute less. Younger workers are slower to enroll than older workers. And so you think about all those things. And one of the things that might come out of a study like this is to say, well, what could we do to enhance contribution rates? So we had one of the companies allowed us to send a survey to all of the people that they were hiring. And we sent it 60 to 90 days after they were hired. And here are just a few of the survey questions trying to highlight why is it that people are behaving like they were. The first question is just to say, did you think that your company did a good job of providing the information? Yeah, that looks pretty good. Then you ask people, who do they go to for information? And, study after study, families and relatives. That may not be your best bet of where to go for information on rates of return, risk, and uncertainty, but a lot of people do that. And here's a slide that's sort of consistent with what we had talked about before. Why aren't you contributing? Well, one is someday. Well, maybe that's inertia, maybe it's a plan. But then paying off student loans, saving for large purchases, cars, houses, and things like that. People do have other priorities than retirement. So you need to think about, what is this person doing in a life cycle concept? Why are people making decisions as they do? For those people that weren't contributing up to the match, well, again, you see something that depends on they're a little worried about various things. They're going to be able to shift into retirement later, and we'll see whether that happens for many people. Do people respond to the match? Looks like yes. So if you think about the policy levers that a company has to try to encourage people, certainly the match is a key one, and employers know that, and presumably workers follow through on that as well. Here are our financial literacy questions that we've used in this study and other studies. Other people have used similar ones. So the interest rate question is basically a compounding question. So how many people really can do compounding? Remember, these people are in big companies that are hiring out of a labor market that's different than a lot of smaller companies, a lot of less prominent companies. Inflation is, do you understand the effect of inflation on future consumption abilities? Investment is the risk issue, one stock versus a mutual fund. And then do you understand the tax advantage, and do you understand the match? And you can see, even on the simple questions, which would be the first three, these numbers are higher than a lot of people get on general surveys of the United States. But the bottom one's a little bit more technical, and people are not doing so well. The other thing to point out here is that even though it's small, there's a statistically significant difference in the average number of correct answers by those participants versus non-participants. That participants are a little bit better in responding to these questions. All right, so having said all that, we can look at lots of different aspects of this issue. One question we wanted to know, well, can we influence people's decisions? So we take a sample of people who were hired in this 2008-2010 that haven't signed up for the 401k plan by 2011. And we work with the employer to create a simple informational nudge, which is basically an email talking about the 401k plan and the advantages that it would have. Employer sends this email out, and we separated this group of new hires into 3 groups, so it's a controlled experiment. Randomly sorted into 3 groups. One was a control group that didn't get the experiment, the nudge. And then we had 2 groups that did receive the nudge, and there were slightly different versions of the flyer. We were trying to test for peer effects as well as informational effects. And so we did that, and this is just basically something that we took from their 401k provider handbook, so we didn't want to confuse them with different sorts of information that they couldn't have gotten earlier. And we're basically just showing some information that we had done about, what would it take to save a little bit of money and how quickly would that grow if you understand compounding and matches. So we sent this out, get the results later, so the employer gives us who's contributing in one time snap, and then a few months later we look at who's contributing in the second time. And what we find is, we were able to move some people. But it's one of these cases that sometimes you say, boy, if I had been a little smarter, I could have done a better job. So here's the case that we did. We provided the same informational nudge to all new hires. Okay, that sounds pretty good, right? We're going to do the right thing. Everybody gets the same one. And I guess I was thinking at the time, well, all new hires are young. Turns out they're not, obviously. And we structured the informational nudge to appeal to someone relatively young. Like, how big is the compounding effect over 30 years, let's say? Well, so the older workers, maybe that didn't resonate so much with them. Maybe they actually thought, well, gee, I'm lost. And so one thing that one can learn in research is do a better job next time. And so my do a better job next time would be, and I've done some of this since then, is to say, what we really need to do is to tailor the nudge to the people. And whether that means by gender or by age or by something else, this is what we did was essentially costless to the employer. It's one email on their own server. Now, it took some of my time to create the email and to create the nudge, but it didn't cost them anything. And they could do the same thing pretty much for free, too. So this is a costless way, and it actually worked pretty well for these young people, increasing, and let me be clear about what we're doing here. This is the increase of the group that got the nudge versus the group that didn't get the nudge. So it's over the control group. So, over time, both sides were increasing some, but the people that got the informational nudge went up by more than that. So an interesting thought that we've looked at, and maybe some of you who read the behavioral finance literature, Richard Thaler's got a book that talks about nudges of all kinds and how you construct choices, and they seem to matter. So employers didn't give this much thought before. Maybe they're giving it more thought now. And so I want to get to the other study quickly. So we've talked mostly about that already. Certainly when employers are making decisions, automatic enrollment matters a lot. Be careful about the defaults. Another thing we did mention, automatic escalation, is where you increase the default contribution rate every year or every so often. That's certainly one way to get off that 3%, because 3% typically is not enough to save for retirement. employer interventions or nudges certainly can influence people's behavior. Okay, a quick pause. Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
How do they decide the percentage of contribution? Like you said, the example of 3%.
So that's an employer decision. So the employers that are going to offer a 401k plan do all the work in terms of setting up the plan. They typically negotiate with a vendor like Vanguard or Fidelity. They typically say to the Vanguard or Fidelity or whoever, we want this plan to look like this. We want some number of investment options, maybe 10, maybe 15. Again, the behavioral finance literature says don't give them too many choices, keep it narrow, but at the same time you want to have people have enough choice that they can fit on whatever risk-return characteristics that they're interested in. And then you decide, okay, I'm going to do automatic enrollment. What's the rate? When these no, not the match, the contribution coming in. So the match is something else. So this is how much are we going to take out of your paycheck every pay period. And when these plans first started, 3% was the norm. And I think there's been a lot of discussion over time about that not being sufficient, because even with 100% match, you're only saving 6%. You probably need to be saving 12 to 15%. So more companies are now moving towards 6% as the default. And then if you match 100% on top of that, that is a pretty good savings rate. You can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and they have some data on how many companies do which of these, but I think the norm is now more towards 6. It was toward 3. Yes, somebody back there? Yeah?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the measurement of the differences between the control and the treatment group. So you effectively measure intention to treat rather than the treatment, right? Because if somebody got the email and didn't read it, they didn't get the information, so they could technically be the control group.
So we have no knowledge about what the person did that got the email, and to the extent that some people didn't, that would sort of bias down the magnitude of the effect that we got. It's from the company. I don't know exactly if you read your company mail, but most people I think probably do, at least look at it and then delete it in a hurry, but you're right. But we know the direction of the bias.
Right, but I was thinking, so if the treatment was effectively information, perhaps we get even a larger difference, because you will make sure that your treatment group is receiving the information. So if you had a workshop, obviously you would call.
Okay, we're going to talk about workshops now, but that wasn't that project. Yes, sir.
If an employer offers a match, what's the incentive on the company to get people to participate, since they're going to have to pay out more if people participate?
Yeah, so the question is really, why does a company want to have a retirement plan at all? So what's the answer to that? It's basically that a company thinks it's in their interest to provide workers with some incentive to save, whether it's through a defined benefit or defined contribution plan. So ultimately, they'll have some resources, so ultimately they'll go away and retire. If they don't have any money in any retirement account and they haven't saved outside, then the probability that they're going to retire when the company wants them to is pretty low. So I put this under the general discussion of employers have their own self-interest involved when they set up their compensation packages, whether we're talking health insurance, pension plans, holidays, whatever it else. You can say, why does companies give paid holidays? Why do you want to pay people not to work, right? Well, there's a reason that companies do that. Part of it is that workers want it, and so they're being competitive to draw them in. And part of it is that it affects the way workers behave on other things like absentee rates and something. Yes?
I think that's true. There is some aspect where there's for employee retention and to attract employees to you to be competitive with other employers, they would want to do that. But I think I understood that maybe certain executives or in a small company, certain principles, if your company offers a 401k, then certain individuals can contribute maybe 20% of their salary if they offer a match for generally for all employees of 2 or 3 or 4%. So I think the higher the general match is, the more the executives can put into their. So I think that's
So a couple of things there. So Congress worried endlessly about this when pension plans first started, and so we have non-discrimination rules, which means that companies can't set up pension plans just for highly compensated people. And the difference between different kinds of workers, there are all kinds of limits on what factors can go into that. For big companies, this is not an issue. Nobody's worrying about the CEO not being able to contribute, and their top amounts that they can contribute. I think currently it's $18,000 for a 401k plan. But if you offer a plan and only the highly compensated, and this could come up like in an accounting office, a doctor's office, a lawyer's office, where you've got a top tier of highly compensated people and some much lower compensated staff, that could happen, and that's one of the things that Congress worried about when they put in these non-discrimination rules. Yes?
Well, I have a question because in your research you said that you gathered data from all the workers hired between 2008 and 2010, right? Well, but probably because that's the peak time of the unemployment after the financial crisis. Do you worry that probably because of financial crisis, once in a lifetime will change people's behaviors, but probably after that people will, like they return back to the means, probably people will change their behaviors after that.
One always worries about time periods, and so that's why it's always useful to have replications of studies and to do things over and over again. Next study we talk about also spans the Great Recession. Us economists, we don't stop working just because it's a bad time to do research, right? So you got to keep your research going, and you just take, what you can say is, here's what happened during this time period. Is it generalizable? Well, you have to see. Okay, so next study I want to spend some time on, and I promise we have to do this in a hurry, was another large grant, this one from the Finland Investor Education Foundation. Again, reached out, partnered with about 8 large national companies to look at what they were doing for their people on the verge of retirement. So this is the end of the period. So these people are all approaching when they could retire. And the companies, again, in their own self-interest, they'd like to know, if you put together compensation packages that are trying to achieve some objectives, like retirement at a particular age, and workers don't understand the programs, they can't understand the incentives that you're trying to give them. So it's in the company's interest to try to be very transparent and let people know what these plans are like. In this case, we had 10 different questions about the company policies as well as some financial literacy issues. Workers are invited to come into these seminars, so there's a selection issue. Our students are going to worry about their selection issue here. So it's a selection issue. People voluntarily come, and selection is always an issue in these kinds of studies. In this particular case, we did repeated surveys for the same companies over an 18-month time period. The companies tell us that they invite people and people are clamoring to come, and that over time, as they keep doing these, almost everybody that's eligible does come. Still might be a selection issue, but that's our approach to this, and you do what you can and you acknowledge what the shortcomings are. So people come into these seminars, they are 55 or so, and these are intensive seminars. They range across our companies from a half a day to 2 days. So the company is basically paying these workers, it's on company time, to come to the seminars. Some of the seminars are done by HR people in-house, and sometimes the company has hired a company to come in and make the presentation for them. Both seem to work. We didn't notice any particular difference. Some workers, companies worry about their workers thinking they're biasing their choices or something. But in any case, we had both kinds. We sent people a survey before they came to the seminar, and then we sent them a survey after they completed the seminar. Some of the companies did this hard copy. You walk into the seminar, you get the survey, you complete it, part 1, do the seminar, then you complete part 2, and then you turn it in. Some we did online through SurveyMonkey that maybe some of you know. And we did it both ways. Some companies switched the technique from one to another, so we've got lots of variation in this. And we're asking 2 questions here. Did people learn, and did they change their behavior? So here's a nice little graph that shows knowledge scores before and after. And what you can see is that the distribution is shifting hard right. That is, people getting the answers right on our survey questions about financial literacy in their programs went up after the program. And is it all smart people learning? Well, maybe, but also we see, if we look at this graph, we see that the low-income people, low scores on the first survey are also improving substantially. So the evidence that we found was people were learning in these seminars, companies were doing them, they were trying to do them the right way, people gave them really high scores, they liked the programs as near as we could tell. Members of our research team went to every company seminar, and maybe we learned something too. But what we see is that, you know, roughly 1/3 of the people after going through the seminar changed their retirement planned date. Now again, you could say, well, plans aren't actions, and that's true. But these are people saying, they're close to retirement, they're saying, I'm planning to retire at 63. They go through the seminar and say, whoa, don't have the right resources, I'm going to retire at 65. And yes, I learned that I can't get full Social Security benefits at 62, I can get it at 65. So those are the kinds of things that they could learn. And based on new knowledge, you re-maximize, if you were putting this in a life cycle mathematical model of individual behavior, this is just a re-maximization because you got some new information. Again, about 1/3 of the people say they changed their planned Social Security age. And this was learning more about what Social Security was and when, you know, the reduction factors and the increasing factors from delaying that. Again, maybe by recognizing their overall wealth, 10 percentage point higher people now saying that they're going to work after they retire from this company. So what we observed through this paper is that people do learn, and based on that new knowledge, they do change their plans. If you send this paper out to referees, they'll always say things like, well, plans aren't actions. Well, people are when you have a plan, if you're following that plan, you're making decisions every day to try to meet that plan. But still, we don't know whether they ultimately will retire later than they did, and maybe they're making better decisions now from this as well. And again, you just see that these programs by these companies got really high ratings. If only my teacher rating forms were this good, that would be great. I might get a raise. So people liked the programs. They thought they were getting them right information. And let me just go to this last point here. So here's what I think are some of the key punchlines of this. Financial literacy is low in the United States. Workplace financial education can improve knowledge and has been shown to do that. Education at the beginning and the end of the working period is essential to moving people toward better retirement planning. Workplace is an excellent place for financial literacy programs. Workers like them, they respond to them, they go to them, and they learn. In some firms, the employer is the trusted advisor and they're a good source of information, and the company does these programs. In other firms, you bring in an outside advisor simply because you want the worker to think that you're hands-off on this process and not trying to nudge them out the door. Defaults matter a lot. Automatic enrollment has a big effect. Automatic escalation can have a big effect. But be careful about what you say. One thing that we didn't mention about defaults are defaults you also have to specify where the money's going. And historically, the default was a money market fund. And the reason for that was you never lose money in a money market fund. Well, you can if inflation's going up, but the employer could always say, well, there's your money. And then when Congress passed some legislation, the new norm for the automatic investment on these are target date funds. And if anybody doesn't know what a target date fund is, we can talk about it, but basically it is a blended fund that has some stocks and some bonds, and it changes over time, and that's become the new norm here for default. Teachable moments are important. There's some research that says around certain things people tend to react differently. And birthdays seem to be one, or promotions, or whatever it is. If you send people a reminder, or if we timed our nudge around something like that, we might have gotten a bigger effect. And some people have tried to do that in their own studies. So, my pessimistic story, when I give talks like this and I talk about individual pension plans and things like this, the pessimistic story is the most likely thing that happen on Social Security is in the future benefits will be lower and taxes will be higher. So if you're starting out, folks on this side of the room maybe, expectations should be much different than they were for some of the people on this side of the room. The likelihood, we don't know what's going to happen. Congress has failed to act year after year after year. Someday soon they'll have to act on something. Most likely some kind of grand compromise that's going to lower benefits, not current benefits, but lower future benefits relative to what's promised, and the tax rate will go up. So you have a lower promise in the future and you'll have to pay more for it today. The role of pensions and health plans, the same sorts of things are happening in that what companies are doing is they're shifting risks to workers on both of these plans. They're increasing contributions to defined benefit plans in the public sector. They're increasing lots of things that cost workers money on the health plans. And as a result then, if you think about, and retiree health plans are just going away in the private sector. I don't know. My guess is that in 10 years there will be no private sector retiree health plans. Public sector retiree health plans are still out there, but they're being reduced in generosity. So the result of this is you have to think about how are you going to fill in a gap that is emerging because your company and your government pension plans and things are going down. At the same time, what you have to pay is going up, so you just have less disposable income out of which you have to save more money. So aren't I Santa Claus? In any case, that makes retirement saving decisions increasingly important. And with that, I will take any other questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
I guess one of the concerns I have is, as you discuss the Social Security issue, the two paradigm is you're going to raise the percentage of money people are going to contribute, or we're going to lower benefits at the end when you take them out. And there's no discussion of the raising the ceiling of $117,000. I think is anything you make over that, you don't pay a penny in Social Security, if I'm correct. Well, I would argue that the economy's changed since Roosevelt was in office, and yet that number has never changed as we go forward. Cap has always been, hasn't it, 117,000?
No.
Am I wrong on that?
So the cap increases every year. It's tied to, I think it's the Social Security covered wage base. But what's happened over time is the proportion of all earnings captured by that cap has gone down. Right. But the cap goes up every year. And to say that there's no discussion...
You know what it is right now?
It's I don't know the exact number, but 170,000 is ballpark right.
I think it's 118.5 for this year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, what's inflation?
There. So it's wrong to say that there's no increase, no discussion on that. People have discussed that. It's been floated around. President Obama, in one of his campaigns, actually proposed that, but he did it in a very strange way. I shouldn't say strange, unusual way, because he had promised on the one hand not to raise taxes on people with under $250,000 of income, And of course, if you raise that cap, that's a bit, it's not just an increase, it's a pretty big increase because you're going from a zero tax bracket to essentially 12% or 6.2 and 6.2, depending on how you calculate that. That's a big increase in taxes. So he couldn't do that. So what he said was, well, we'll put the tax back on once you make more than $250,000. So it was a very political sort of crafting of that. Some people are regularly saying exactly what you're doing. Why not increase that cap? Why not say everything? And oh, by the way, Medicare used to have the same cap as Social Security, and somewhere about 1986, they did take the cap off Medicare, and the Medicare tax is paid on all earnings, no cap. Why they didn't do that with Social Security at the same time, I don't know, but they didn't. The other issue that comes into play is that there's a link between the tax and the benefit. Now, you could sever that link, and you could say, if you make more than this amount, no more, and even though you have to pay the tax on more earnings, your benefit won't go up. Actually, the biggest defenders of the Social Security system 20 years ago opposed that kind of thing because they wanted it to stay where they could always say there's a link between every dollar you pay and the benefits that you get, even if it's really small. Whether that's needed or not today, who knows? But I would say it's wrong to say it's not discussed. It hadn't happened, and it's also slightly wrong to say it's not going up. It just goes up. It's like a lot of things with Social Security. It's indexed and it goes up on a regular basis, but not enough to have a big effect on the total amount of earnings that are covered by the tax. Yes?
So I have a question regarding the treatment that you choose for the two experiments. So we know that financial literacy is really linked to information, and the problem is information asymmetry, that people don't know the benefits, and that's why part of it is that's why they don't choose right. I think the million-dollar question really is does it matter how you provide this information? And I was thinking, did you ever think about comparing treatments? For instance, let's say you get information, but you get information through email, and then you have a workshop and see, because if the results are really the same, the most cost-effective measure would be the email, right? So I was thinking if you thought about comparing treatments.
So the email was for a very different group than the seminars, right? So the seminars are people on the verge of retirement. A very different kind of teachable moment it is. When you think about that time of your life, a few years out for you, there are certain decisions that you make that are irreversible. So you have to be really careful. Like when you quit your job, you retire from your job, your career job, the likelihood that you're going to be hired back at the same position by that company is pretty low. I mean, you could go out in the labor market and find other jobs, but that's very different than staying on your same job. So these decisions are irreversible, and they're also influenced by all of these other types of programs that we're talking about. So you have to make this decision. Ultimately, you have to make the decision, and you need all the information you can. And so this intensity of the seminars is what companies were doing. I mean, I didn't set these up. The companies had them in operation. Actually, when we were working with some of the companies, two of the companies decided to start the plans after we talked with them, and so we sort of started the first ones. The other companies were already running these programs, and so we just got into what they were doing. So we didn't try to say to the company, you're doing it wrong. We said, can we monitor your program and give you a report on it? And on the basis of our report, companies subsequently did some things, but it really wasn't our experiment other than they allowed us to observe, they allowed us to survey people before and after, and that's the extent of that. On the new hires, it's very different. People are just hired, and so that email is a refresher from something that's only a few years away. I wouldn't say that nudges of simple variety, like an informational nudge for the person near retirement, wouldn't work. In fact, probably would have some effect. Whether we would get the same size of effects that we see in the seminars, I don't know. But there's a lot of, you think about spending a day, the company is paying you for a day to sit through this seminar. And workers are trying to get in and being turned away in some cases, but they're trying to get in. So the worker is giving their time, although they're paid and they're not having to work, and the company is paying for it, so they're trying to provide information that will help the worker make appropriate and optimal decisions. And that's very different than just a simple information nudge. Yeah?
Go ahead.
One of the conclusions in the research was workplace is the best place for financial literacy. So as we saw in the previous part of the seminar that, you were saying that there's a slow transition from defined benefit plans to defined contribution. So over here, when it comes to defined contribution, the onus is on the employee to decide where my money is going, where should it be, so where it should be invested in. So I think rather than workplace being the best place for financial literacy, I think it should start pretty early in your life, so that by the time you have started working, you have some idea about the investments, what's portfolio, what are assets called.
Yeah, so do I have any evidence that it's the best? I should go back and look at my slides. Did I really say best? I certainly think it's a very good place. And the reason for that is that it is where lots of things are driven by what the company is offering. So you need to know what your pension plan is and how it affects you. You need to know whether or not the company is going to provide you with health insurance afterwards. You need to know your options about taking your money out of the 401k plan and what happens when you do. And if you don't understand those, you can't make very good decisions. That's not to say that financial literacy programs in high schools wouldn't be good, and certainly we've already argued that financial literacy programs at the time of hiring is certainly important. And one of the things that's happened recently is if you look at companies, they don't really have orientation programs anymore. Who's been hired recently? So you go to a company, you get hired, and it used to be you had this nice rah-rah program. You got to a little party, and everybody told you what was great about the company. Now you get a disc, and that's it. Now, how many people watch their disc and follow all the ins and outs of it and follow through on the encouragement? I don't know, but it's certainly changing the way that information. But it still says, at the time of hiring, it's a very good time to have some nudging. Yes?
Well, I'm wondering about the changes in the workforce and employment and increase of contingent workers and those sorts of things. So how does that, what do you think about the challenges that presents to this?
So contingent workers are a difficult issue. In many cases, they wouldn't be eligible for these benefits to begin with, whether it's the 401k plan or a defined benefit plan or a health plan. A lot of employers, you have to be whatever they call full-time to be eligible for those kinds of benefits. And so my guess would be, I don't know this for sure, but my guess would be they would get less attention through the financial literacy types of programs or retirement planning programs as well, simply because they don't affect them. So in terms of selecting people to go to these programs, I would doubt that contingent workers would make the cut. 4 minutes. One more question, maybe. Depends on how long the answer is, I guess.
Well, so let me follow up with that then.
Okay.
So where should we provide that training for those people who are, there's two sides to this. On the one hand, if hiring is a good time to present information, that's a teachable moment. One thing that's happened is people are being hired more often in the course of their career, right? So they're having more hires. So in a way that's good, you have more opportunities. And at the same time, people are getting hired for more part-time, where they're, putting together a few different, the gig economy. So that puts the onus, that shifts the onus from employers to someplace else. Society, AIER.
There you go. Okay, so you're going to run a program for, let's say, 30 million people. How many people can you get in here a day? Sounds like a crowded room. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to think that employers would think it's in their best interest to spend resources for people that are part-time and not going to be with them very long, whether that's on-the-job training or anything else. And this would include higher education, by the way. So for those of you that have some knowledge about how universities treat contingent workers, it's not so good either. So who should do that? And I don't know. I mean, should the federal government or state governments have programs that have free financial literacy programs for anybody? Maybe. There are a lot of opportunities that are out there at probably pretty low cost now. I don't know community colleges and places what tuition is for those kinds of programs, but I would bet that the contingent worker is rarely driven into those programs because they are more concerned about today and making sure they're able to get up the next morning and do their two jobs. But yeah, I'd have no information really on that.
What about the ability, I don't know how to say this right, but the assumption as you talk where all workers are going to get this education, but the ability of the worker to benefit from that education may have to do with his educational level or her educational level. So is there any look that you've done at that to see if you've got a company like a GM and you've got a certain high percentage, maybe high school graduates only, are they going to benefit from the same tutorial that others would?
Well, what our seminar results showed was that people that scored low on the beginning, before the seminar, had significant positive increases after the seminar. So in that sense, I mean, I'm sure in our report we have something on education levels too, but just going from what do you know here to what do you know there, that slide showed a big increase for the people that scored low at the beginning. So some things are hard, some things are easy, some things we just don't know. And it shouldn't take too much to be able to convince a person that if they have a 1% raise but that the prices go up by 2%, they can't buy as much, even though they have more dollars in hand. It shouldn't take too much to try to convince people on some simple compounding that if you put $100 in the bank today and the interest rate's 2%, after 5 years, do you have more or less than $102? And those are the types of questions that people are missing on these surveys. Math is just hard for a lot of people. But some simple concepts would be really helpful if they can master those. And so I wouldn't give up trying, no matter what socioeconomic education level they have.
All right, well, thank you very much.